Another live edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast on thehannibaltv.com. My name is Jack Kilby, Executive Vice President of Great North Wrestling, and I'm very pleased tonight to welcome an individual who is the son of a true legend, a true Hall of Famer, and a very, very important individual in the modern era of professional wrestling, and also another in the series of interviews that I've had the pleasure of conducting with relatives, children of professional wrestlers. And I am speaking, of course, of Mr. Justin Race, son of handsome Harley Race. Justin, thanks for taking the time to do this today.
Absolutely, Jack. Would want to be anywhere else.
Tremendous. I think it's a question that you've probably got a lot, but it gives the fans some perspective as to how it was growing up in the household of not only a professional wrestler, but a man who truly was so important in.
You froze up on me a little bit there. Not just a professional wrestler, but what?
A man who was so important and high profile in the industry. In the territory days, one of the last traveling NWA champions, of course, your dad. What was that experience like, given that travel schedule?
Well, I mean, first of all, I was blessed. I mean, I had a very unique, very interesting childhood, but I was in probably 5 or 6 different countries before I was 10 years old. And I'm not Mexico or Canada. I'm talking about the Far East and Europe. And it was the only time because there, of course, there's no season in wrestling. He wrestled 300 days a year. So if I wanted to spend any time with my dad, I traveled with him. When I was younger, that was quite easy. They pulled me out of school. My dad pulled me out of school for a month once to go to Japan. And in the elementary level, the teachers were like, fine, he'll learn more there than he will here. Mm-hmm. So, and then as I got older and got into my own sports and whatever, it became a little more difficult. But yeah, I'll never forget traveling all over the place with him. It is unique, like you said, in that it's a one-man sport. Like the Kansas City Chiefs here in town. Well, there's 60 players on the Chiefs, and they all have 2 kids. That's 120 kids that their father basically has the same job. I mean, they play football. Whereas with my dad wrestling all year round, even when he was in town, he was still working. So it's unique, blessed, kind of like maybe when I was talking about the football and, that all the kids had the dads had the same job. Kind of like a golfer almost. You travel with your parents. You go, where they go. You do what they do, and there's not really anybody unless, like, when I was a kid. Of course, I had a lot of friends that were, like Dwayne Johnson was a friend of mine when his dad used to wrestle my dad, and guys like that. When we were kids, 8 years old. We had fun together, but we, and could talk a little bit, but there wasn't really when you're here in your hometown, there wasn't anybody that I could say, what happened today? And then say, yeah, I understand what you mean. Because no one did. Mm-hmm. No one understood what it was like. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I missed a lot of school. My mom did a lot of tutoring. My mom was as much of a teacher when I was younger as my teachers were. Mm-hmm. We'd drag my homework and we'd go to Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, wherever. Mm-hmm. But again, I'm very blessed to have grown up how I did. Even hardships are, everyone has hardships. If there was anything, it was I missed him a lot because he was gone so much.
Yes, especially during that era. Did it ever? It strikes me that when you're in that sort of phase of growing up and you're small, that you don't really realize that other families and other kids aren't experiencing the same things. Was there a point in time where it kind of hit you, whoa, I'm living a pretty unique circumstance here? And did you ever wish to be, more traditional in terms of having a traditional parent doing a traditional job, that sort of thing?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I did. Especially when he was gone, my friends, they went home after school and they had dinner with their parents and whatever. And often that wasn't the case at my house. It was a mixture of happiness and a little bit of sadness. I'd always wish, I'm sure I probably told my parents this 100 times, but I was like, why couldn't Dad just have been an insurance salesman or something? It made my life easier. But then on the other side, people would always, my friends were, the friends I grew up with my dad too. So he was no big deal to them. But I'd meet kids my age, or a new kid would move into the school district, and they'd always play a trick on him. They'd tell him how mean my dad was. And then they'd go over, then I'd tell him to come on over to the house, and they'd find out my dad was there. The new kid would be, he'd be scared to death, about to wet his pants. Dad would walk up to him and give him one of those promo looks, and then just smile and I'm just kidding. Don't worry about it. So we had some fun with some people that weren't used to him. But people would say, what's Ric Flair doing? What's Hulk Hogan doing? What's Bulldog Bob Brown doing? And I was like, what's your dad do? Oh, he's a insurance salesman. I said, so what's his coworkers doing right now on the weekend? Well, I don't know. Well, I don't know what my dad's coworkers are doing either.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I wasn't sarcastic about it. I was just kind of put it in a reference of, this is just how who'd you wrestle? What, where, how much, who won this? He was just home. I didn't care where he had been.
Mm-hmm. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to ask you, in terms of how your dad's persona as a tough guy, not around the time of the King character, but when he was NWA champion, a double tough, nasty heel, et cetera, how did, and to top that off, had the reputation of being a legit tough guy as well. How did that whole persona impact your family life, if at all? Was there a separation between who your dad portrayed as a character and who he was? Because it seemed like there was a lot of the real man in that NWA toughest guy on God's green earth character.
Yeah. That is not just a phrase. That is the truth. And you can ask any wrestler from Flair down to the newest guy in the business, and the newest guys will know by anecdotally that he was just tough dude. He grew up on a farm, moved away from home when he was 14 years old because his parents couldn't afford to feed him. Town of 93 people that now has 63 people or 65 people in it. Big sign when Harley Race was born here. So it was rough. There were some tough things that happened. And there were some tough things that happened to him because being the villain, you kind of took that. I mean, some kids that weren't necessarily friends of mine, kind of took that to heart. And I thought he was, like I was saying, the joke we'd play on the new guy in school when he came over to my house. Well, there are people that, especially back then, wrestling is such an emotional sport. I mean, fans get attached to somebody and they will kill for him. And so sometimes, I got a little bit of that. I got a little bit of, especially, I guess, where I really can think of that mattered the most was when I was in kids wrestling, and there's mats rolled out all over the gym, 8 matches going on at a time or whatever. You're 8 years old, and every time I'd wrestle, everyone in the auditorium would focus on my match and start chanting against me, even cussing at me. And I'd say, Dad, why are they yelling at me? He's, don't worry about it, they're yelling at me. But it has an effect on you after a while. You're like, man, I'm just an 8-year-old out here trying to compete at 48 pounds or 47 pounds, whatever it was. So yeah, some people took it to heart. They took it home with them, and then they brought it with them whenever I was around. But it goes with the territory. He was such a good heel that he just made people hate him. I mean, just on the fans are so monogamous to their wrestlers that they'll kill for him. Well, the other way around, if they hated you that much, we would. Well, I remember leaving. Well, several times, but one particular time, and from Greensboro, I think it was Greensboro. And my dad took forever to get dressed and whatever after the matches. And it drove my mom nuts. What is he doing in there? But he was waiting for people to go away so we could leave and it was safe. And sometimes it wasn't safe. You'd come out and they'd have, 20 police officers with riot shields, and they'd hold them over the top of our heads as we were walking towards the car, hundreds, thousands of people. And they were throwing rocks, knives, fork, anything they could throw, they were throwing at us. And here, an 8-year-old little boy, his mom and dad, and they're just hurling stuff at us, and you hear it hitting the riot shields, and they get you to the car, and we'd go smoking out of there, so no one could follow us. But it's like, geez, people take this stuff seriously.
Must have been terrifying for an 8-year-old kid.
It was. It was something that I've never, people always say, ask people, ever have anything tragic happen to you when you were a child? And I'd say, well, besides watching my dad get that shit kicked out of him 6 nights a week, I might have been in a car wreck once.
It's hard to for today's younger fans to fathom that a couple of generations ago, such vitriol and hatred was exhibited towards wrestlers, because of believability, I think, was a large part of it. Not that the kayfabe was still in existence, but your dad was most certainly believable as the individual that he portrayed in the ring, without a doubt.
Which was completely different when he wasn't in the ring. But an interesting thing, you were talking about, the transition in the time. Now they use breakaway chairs. Back then, fans would actually get up out of their metal chair, fold it up, and hand it to Ric Flair so he could hit my dad with it. It's like, jeez. And then they just stood the rest of the matches because that chair was gone.
And never got thrown out.
But at the kindest people I've ever met. We used to, when I was younger, we'd go to Children's Mercy Hospital and hand out Christmas presents to the kids on Christmas Eve every year. And there were some times when he couldn't, that the child was so bad off or whatever that dad couldn't go in the room. He'd just start crying, and he was just so sentimental about kids and animals. I've got that in myself, actually. I can't stand those ASPCA commercials. I literally turn them off. I donate to the ASPCA, but I can't watch the commercials. So he was always fatherly to me, always insisted that I be a gentleman. My mom taught me how to be a gentleman, and he made sure I stayed that way. She taught me I was opening the door for a lady before I could reach the doorknob. But he insisted that I keep that going at all times. Even when I got a little bit older and was a teenager, he's like, it's still sir and ma'am unless they ask you to say their name. So I do appreciate that from both my parents. My mom, teaching it to him, my dad making sure it was kept, was good manners, being a gentleman. And he was a lot of fun too, though. He was hilarious. You remember those commercials years ago about the E.F. Hutton financial advisors, and their tagline, their commercials was, if E.F. Hutton talks, people listen.
Yes.
That's how it was around my dad. In dressing room, wherever he was, he didn't say much. Very, very quiet person. But when he did say something, it was either hilarious or full of wisdom. So it was, hey, if Harley talks, people listen. The dressing, and he'd get this look. He'd kind of look over here, and then he'd look over there, and he'd scratch his, and you knew he was about to talk. So everyone's kind of preparing for the moment. And, well, you know, and he'd tell the funniest story anybody ever heard.
You started going to his matches at an early age. It sounds like. Two-part question: when you were going as a child, did he smarten you up to let you know that he wasn't, even though it was really dangerous with some of the crowd stuff, like when he got stabbed, but just in the context of a regular match, did he say, this is,
Well,
I'm not really getting hurt? That's the first part.
Well, not necessarily. My mom, when we traveled with him, my mom and dad had like a little code word or whatever. When we get to a town, and is this going to be a wrestling match, or is this going to be a bloodbath? And bloodbath. Obviously, my mom and I go to a movie or miniature golf or whatever. But they weren't always right. They made mistakes, and I went to some bloodbaths, and I cried. Yes. I thought they were going to kill my dad. Yes. I mean, I remember when I was cognizant enough to going on, watching him get hit with a chair and body slammed and suplexed on the concrete. They didn't have mats around the ring back then. It was the concrete. I figured, well, I know I'm going to be wheeling him around in a wheelchair by the time he's 50, 60. You come to terms with it. But there were a lot of times my mom would have to take me out of the arena because I was just scared to death. And then, she'd let me run back in the dressing room and see my dad, and I'd hug him, and he's okay. I never, I guess I never thought he was going to die. It was just hard seeing that your dad get put through like that. I posted some pictures on Facebook or Instagram somewhere where, he's blood running, we're in the dressing room, blood running down his face. He's got a trophy in front of him and the world title belt there. And I'm there with a big smile on my face. My mom and him are like kissing or something. And I wrote as a caption, this is a successful night at the race house. And you got dad blood dripping all over him and whatever. So I eventually got used to it, but no, I was led to, everything was real. Mm-hmm. And back then, a lot of it was. Mm-hmm. They, just because the promoters said one person was going to go over on the other, didn't mean that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. The old double cross. In terms of all of your dad's matches in totality, if you had to narrow them down, what would you consider your personal favorites, both in the NWA as world champion, etc., and the WWF period as the
June 10th, 1983, in the Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis, Missouri, against Ric Flair. He won the 7th world title, beating Luthez, had the record at 6, and he won the 7th world title. And I remember the date. I remember everything about that night. I'll never forget it. It was one of the coolest nights of my life.
Was that because he won the belt or just?
Well, yeah, he won the belt. I was old enough to realize that he was a pretty big deal. When you're growing up around your friends and your kids and all, it doesn't seem, you don't see the big picture. But the band Molly Hatchet actually was playing on the other half of Kiel Auditorium that evening. And they finished their set, came over, watched Dad win the title, and he came out and we all got a picture taken. My mom, my dad, and I, and Molly Hatchet. It was on the front page of Rolling Stone magazine.
That's a big deal.
So that night will always stick out to me. There's a photo of him hugging me. I'd have been 12, almost 13 at the time. When he finally did the ceremony and whatnot in the ring, and he finally got back toward the dressing room, right as he was walking into a dressing room, I walked up to, we met, and I put my arms around him. He hugged me. I was about this tall on him. And a Japanese photographer took that picture. And that picture the next day was on the front page of the Tokyo newspaper.
Wow.
And with circulate the front page, not the front of the sports page, the front page of the newspaper, which is the circulation of about 22 million at the time. And it said, Harley Race, 7-time world champion, not human, but God. Mm-hmm. There's old lore, and there's Japanese lore during the samurai warrior days. a warrior, if a samurai went to 7 battles and survived, he was proclaimed a god. So hence what they started calling my father there. And that picture of him, and I looked for that picture for years, and I never could. I mean, I tried to hunt down in the archives of the Japanese newspaper, this, that. One day I found it on the internet. A fan had posted it. How in the heck did they get that?
That's super cool.
So yeah, it's in fact, that's probably one of my more important photos of he and I together there is, because I just remember the emotion. It wasn't like he went in one time and won the 7th world title. He'd been working at it for a year, or I don't remember how long, but there'd been so many, almost a disappointment. And so that time it was like a relief. He had finally done it, and it was an emotional event.
History making.
Yeah.
Ryan Brown is put forth a question I was going to ask you later on. He's saying, Justin, I've only seen your father on TV, true legend in the business. Did you ever want to lace up a pair of boots and follow his footsteps into professional wrestling?
Well, behind is it fake? That's probably the second most question I've ever fielded in my life. I wish I had a nickel for every time someone asked me that. My mom and dad kind of kept me away from the business, that aspect of there wasn't ever a question of whether I was going to follow dad or not. My dad told me, you're going to get an education, use your head, not your body. It's a lot easier on your body. Look at me, and he's 40 some years old, gimping around. And I did real well in school. I grew up on a golf course, and my dad, and you can make a lot of money doing it. But being who I was with my father, I had to play football and wrestle and get hurt and broken bones. And now I'm looking back going, that's probably a good idea. I should have just played golf.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was rugged.
Mm-hmm. In terms of those.
Just to finish though, I'm sorry, I lost train of thought. So they kept me away from ever going to lace up my boots. It was never a consideration. There was never am I going to go to college? Am I not going to go to college? It's what scholarship am I going to take in college and get educated? And my dream was always to be a professional football player. Then I did get a scholarship, Division I school. A couple of them I chose SMU. But when I was a sophomore in high school, I broke my neck in a wrestling match, cracked the 3rd vertebrae and compressed disc above and disc below. But I still continued to play sports after that healed. But when I got to college level and I did a physical for my scholarship, they had me turn my head. That's all the farther you could turn your head? And I said, well, I'm just working out. I'm trying to make some excuse. They put me in a CAT scan machine and found the calcium deposit in my 3rd vertebra. And the coach, it was at SMU, the coach then was Forrest Gregg. Forrest Gregg, according to Vince Lombardi, was the toughest football player he ever coached. And Forrest Gregg brought me into his office and he said, I'm sorry, you can't play football anymore. Mm. So that was the end of that. So I think much to my parents' relief, I was not, I was done with combat sports, and well, I've used my head since then.
Mm-hmm. Well, probably better off physically for it, for sure.
Well, and the time spent alone, I mean, they couldn't foresee the future, of course. So back then, like I said, 300 days of the year, if you didn't travel with him, you didn't see him. Whereas nowadays they have these big events and the Monday Night Raw, and they have all these big events, and the going town to town thing has kind of went away. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And my dad, so they didn't want me to be away from my family as much as he was. Because it was so hard on the family. And he was never really truly off. When he came back to Kansas City from a tour and wherever, East Coast or Europe or Japan, wherever, he believed that back before, of course, cable and circuit TV and or what you call it, pay-per-view, he believed all people should deserve to see the world champion. So when he was in town off, so to speak, we would travel to any town that was in 6 to 8 hour driving distance. I've been to every one horse town in Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma or Arkansas. And he'd go to these little towns, the 400 population, 400, 399 of them showed up for the wrestling match. And he would wrestle their hometown boy. And he would let their hometown boy beat the crap out of him for 58 minutes. And of course, he'd come back and win in the next 2. But when he left town, those people thought their little hometown boy came this close to being world champion. And that's one of the reasons why he is a GOAT among his peers and a GOAT to fans, is he would do anything for the business or for his fans to make them feel special, to make them, you know, world champions in St. Louis, but that's a 5-hour drive for us. Well, no, he'd come to them. And that really affected a lot of people. I get in correspondence that I get through social media and all. I mean, I apologize, but I met you in 1978 at, you know, in such and such Missouri and this and that, and I'm like, oh, okay. I'm not trying to be rude or anything. I don't remember it, but I'm glad you enjoyed the matches. Glad you know, I'm very happy that you're faithful and a follower of my father.
Yeah, absolutely. During the period of Vince Jr.'s first national expansion, when it was clear that he had a plan, he was disrespecting the territories. It always seemed to me that your dad took particular umbrage to that situation. And we saw in the Dark Side of the Ring episode the meeting between Vince and your dad when he was supposedly offered X number of dollars to not show up to Starrcade. Was that a very stressful time in general for your dad when he could see that, you know, the man who was really the personification?
I mean, I was old enough then, I was a teenager, so I, you know, knew what was going on. And, you know, my dad had poured his heart and soul into not only being a world champion, but also being a part of the Midwest territories, the Central States, I guess. Central States title is what it's called back then. And yeah, Vince just kind of moved in with these big, huge events and started taking things over. And, you know, he coordinated that with pay-per-view, with cable, so that people in the town of 400, that the only way they could see the world champion 5 to 10 years before that, or 3 years before that, whatever, was for my dad to go to them. Well, Vince figured out, wait, now we can do this all on the air. We don't have to go to them. We can just go to Chicago, New York, Atlanta, LA, and do these big shows, and people can still see it on TV. And hence the territories couldn't survive that. I mean, you can't survive going against a WrestleMania with 30 or 40 small towns of 400 people. I mean, it just didn't, the numbers just didn't add up. So it upset him, upset my dad. He was the kind of the transition guy. He brought wrestling to TV, wrestling at the Chase in St. Louis, but TV wasn't as big then as it was as he got later into, you know, the 80s and 90s. And then all of a sudden, you know, pay-per-view, anybody could watch one of those matches. So it pained him, but yet, I mean, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Yeah, absolutely. One piece of urban legend, or whatever you want to call it, that I as a fan have been familiar with for years, was the story about when WWF was running in Kansas City and your dad showed up to the lock. Now they portrayed that in a way in the Dark Side of the Ring that I had no idea that it occurred. What I had always heard was he actually showed up and pulled a gun on Hogan for running in his territory. There it said that he showed up and burned the ring to the ground. What's the actual reality of that story?
Well, burning a ring to the ground is quite impossible. A lot of it was exaggerated. To be perfectly honest with you, most of it happened, but there still was the very unique relationship that wrestlers have with each other. And once Dad went over to the WWE as the King, he and Hogan had the utmost respect for each other. My dad taught him how to wrestle for the most part. We lived in Tampa, Florida, when I was very young, 3-4 years old. There was a biker bar that my dad used to go to, and Hogan kept coming in there and poking at him, telling him he wanted to be a wrestler. And Dad would punch him in the face and throw him out the door. And after several times of this, he said, "Boy, you're a tenacious son of a." And he said, "All right, show up at this place at this time, and I'll teach you how to wrestle." So that, regardless of the bad blood, when the WWF started taking over the territories, well, WWE now started taking over the territories, regardless of the bad blood, they were still co-workers, so to speak. And co-workers in a very unique working situation. And I remember we were in the excuse me. Excuse me. We were in Meadowlands, and Dad's wrestling, his big Halliburton bag that he carried, his bag didn't make it on the plane, or we couldn't find it at the airport, what have you. And we got to the Meadowlands, and he told Terry Hogan, I don't have my bag, whatever. And at that, Hulkamania was huge then, and Hogan, loud voice, bellowed out, "Anyone that isn't wrestling, go to the airport and find the boss's luggage." And they did, and they found it. But that's the respect he had for him. Is he's Hulkamanian. He was, people were going crazy, but it was the boss, and the boss didn't have his luggage.
Touché. When he made the decision to join WWF and adopted the King gimmick, as a fan who knew his work before, it was kind of a juxtaposition, because in many ways he was the personification of the NWA and old school wrestling, no nonsense. Then he became this sort of character, this some have called it cartoonish character initially, but then it seemed as he got into his tenure with the Heenan family, it kind of grew on people. How did he feel about that when it was pitched to him that you're going to be this king? And then did he grow to be more comfortable or like it more as his tenure went on?
Well, first of all, that was kind of like, if Vince was going to get him, that's the role he was going to play. There was no question. He wasn't just going to come in as handsome Harley or whatever. He was the king of wrestling, and that's how he's going to come in there, regardless of his age. And he still kept up with those young guys. In fact, some of them wish he hadn't. He controlled. He was the ring general, and regardless of whether he was the king or handsome Harley Race or whatever, and regardless of what the outcome of the match was going to be, if it wasn't going how he wanted it, or something was going wrong, he'd get him in an armbar and lean down next to the ear, "Don't piss me off." And they didn't. So he took it on, and as people looked at him more that way, like, kind of thought about it for a moment, what actual king means, the king of wrestling. You're talking about, well, Arnold Palmer was the king of golf. So you put it in more of a, rather than just a moniker, but an actual personality. I think he played it well, and he kind of started to enjoy it. I mean, he liked walking around with that crown and that cape, telling everyone, "Get out of my way, King's coming through."
And he managed.
He went from being a heel that was liked to a heel that was despised.
Exactly.
And he's after 40 years of wrestling, you can adapt to anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he managed to. A lot of the fans really, really disliked that character, and that means he was doing his job really, really well.
They hated the character. They hated him. They didn't mind the autographs, and they liked the dolls. Probably because then they'd have another doll to beat up on all the time. But yeah, he enjoyed that, and even then, he actually captured another name. All of my life, he's been either called Mr. Race or the Boss by anybody associated with wrestling. That includes the young kids nowadays that are 20 some years old. But he also started to call him the King, and the older wrestlers still call him the Boss or Mr. Race, and some of the younger guys just referred to him as King. They didn't say the King; they'd say, "Hey, King, what about this? Hey, King, what about that?" Mm-hmm. So yeah. Did I lose you there for a second?
Oh, you froze up just for a sec, but
I'm back. I hope.
Yeah, yes, you are. A fan is asking Bruce Gas, Boxing and Jazz and more, saying, how would your dad fit into WWE today? That's an interesting supposition.
Probably as a booker or promoter. He never was a big fan of that showy showmanship stuff. I mean, Flair, yeah, he liked Flair's gimmick. He thought that was fun. Mm-hmm. Back then. But when he started his wrestling school, he used to tell me, he said, I used to wrestle Flair an hour at a time every night. Now it takes him 20 minutes to get to the ring for a 10-minute match. Or what else? He just had all these. I teach him when he opened the school. He said, I teach them how to wrestle. They go up to Vince and learn how to be movie stars. So it would be rough for him. He's an old school man. Mm-hmm. In fact, the motto of his wrestling school was "Shut up and wrestle." Mm-hmm. So he and Flair had people sitting on the edge of their seat for one solid hour. But now people are used to the high flying acrobats and these matches. They last 5 minutes, but there's more happening in a 5-minute match than there could have been in a 30-minute match back in the day. But the fans are getting used to that, and that's what they're expecting. And the show and the storylines and all that stuff that didn't happen when he was there, the fans kind of take those storylines to heart, even though they know that they're a storyline. It's kind of like thinking, one of your action heroes on a movie screen is like that in public. And it's like, no, that's Bruce Willis played, John McClane in Die Hard. He's not like that all the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
That was actually something that I wanted to ask you about, the change in the style that your dad cut his teeth on and was the symbol of the NWA, that no nonsense pro wrestling. When the high spot of his match with Flair in Starrcade 83 is the crossbody off the top rope, and that's the high spot. How did he feel about the this what's termed now as get your shit in now, and a lack of psychology, but so many moves packed into a match?
I think it concerns him a lot because he did. Now he's toughest dude on God's green earth, so I don't know. No one could have followed his steps, but he did do it for nearly 40 years, and he watches those kids, or before he passed away, when we'd watch those kids nowadays together, he'd be like, how in the hell are they doing that? Or he'd say, that kid's going to last about 1.5 years, 2 years. He's going to get hurt, and that'll be the end of him. Mm-hmm. Because of all the craziness. I mean, there was something so alluring about a headlock or a wrist lock between him and Barry Windham or Dory or Terry Funk Jr., the Briscoes. The list goes on, but they could hold that in the center of the ring for 5 minutes, and people were still on the edge of their seats. And that you got my father always said, no, I'm not. When you give up, you give up. No, or if he was on the other side, ask him, ref, ask him. And that kept people on the edge of their seat without all the jumping and the flying, except for the flying headbutt, of course. But most of the moves those guys use nowadays, they were originated somewhere in the Harley era by him. In fact, they call it a Harley when someone does a move as similar to my father's as they could have. They call it a Harley.
Mm-hmm.
The pile driver, the suplex,
just not as many crammed into one match.
Yeah, they do. He worries. I think he worries more about the kids nowadays because of all that trying to cram so much into a short match that they're going to get hurt, and that's going to be the end of their career. And then what are they going to do?
Mm-hmm.
They don't have a master's in business, so he's concerned. But then again, they don't get hit over the.
Sorry, you froze up there again. But I want to also ask you about your personal experience with Vince McMahon when your dad was in the company, notwithstanding their acrimonious start around Starrcade '83, but when he was in the company, do you have any memorable interactions with him?
Yeah, I really, I can, for everything that's said about Vince, he is a very shrewd, tough businessman, but so are most successful businessmen. But he's always been the most gentlemanly, kind person to me as anybody I've ever met. He was just always nice to me. I remember you were talking about when he became king. That was in Poughkeepsie, New York, and I was down in the locker room, and I was probably 13 or 14 or so, and I found, I guess, lying on the floor, I found $240 in $20 bills. And I took it and I gave it to my dad. I said, Dad, here, this money was laying over here on the ground or whatever. And he took it and he went to Vince and he said, Vince, my son found this money. And Vince said, well, that's a pretty honest young man you have there to find it, give it to you. Now you're giving it to me. He said, let him keep it. What the hell is he going to do with $240? He didn't need $240. And Vince is like, hold on, Harley, watch this. And he turned to the dressing room and he said, anybody lose any money? Of course, everyone, I did. Bobby Heenan, he said, is it green? And so he's like, he turned back to my dad. He said, see, we're not going to find out whose this is. And my dad said, well, Justin's not keeping it. And Vince said, all right, Harley, it's mine. And he took it and he was going to looking like he was going to put it in his pocket. And he looked at me and handed it to me. And he said, and now I'm giving it to you. And I thought that was, I didn't know of Vince and all the not nice things that had been said about him, but it was awfully nice to me. Years later, when Dad was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in New York, after the ceremony was over, there's a black tie ceremony, real formal, and he got on the elevator to go up, and Vince and his wife just happened to get in the elevator at the same time as my dad and I and my dad's wife at the time. And I had to ask. I turned around and I said, Mr. McMahon, do you remember in New York when I found that money and you gave it back? He said, absolutely, I remember that. I'll never forget that. I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. He remembers that.
That's awesome.
So I have nothing but good things to say about him. He did a lot of changing to the business, but change is going to happen. Now we have computers in our hands.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good point.
And we can do these podcasts and all the publicity that I've been doing lately. Back in the day when they did a TV interview with my family, I mean, there's 5-6 people, lighting crews and producers and on-air talent and light and this and that. And now one guy shows up with the camera and he's the interviewer, the cameraman, and everything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, change is inevitable.
Yeah, that's how I looked at wrestling. It's gonna go. It's gonna happen.
Your dad, as was touched on in the Dark Side of the Ring, and you've spoken about here, he obviously had a strong sense of values, and I was wondering what values did he instill in you that have stayed with you throughout your own life?
You have to be a man of your word. He taught me that during the Starrcade fiasco. He told him he was going to be at Starcade. He went to Starcade. He taught me to be a man of my word. He taught me to be a gentleman, like I said. And he taught me integrity. He asked me, and he made me memorize. I was very young. He said, "You know what the definition of integrity is?" And I said, "Oh, being honest, whatever." He said, "It's doing the right thing when no one's watching." And because he's always watching. And so I took that to heart, and I've tried to do that all my life. I mean, I messed up. Oh yeah, a million times. But that's one of the things that he just be a man of your word, be a man of honor, and be a man of integrity, and be kind to those less fortunate. He always instilled on me, as far as wrestling fans go. He used to tell me, he's like, if they recognize me or recognize you or whatever, give them their 5 minutes. Unless you're late, unless you're bleeding to death or late for work or something, stop and give them their 5 minutes to tell you about when they used to watch me on TV on Saturday mornings, or what's Ric Flair doing right now, or just let them ask their questions, be gracious, answer them. He said, because they'll never forget that 5 minutes in their life.
True.
And it's an honor. And he basically instilled in me, it's more of an honor for them to recognize me than it is for me. I'm the honored one. It's like, wow, you know my dad? You know that about my dad? Wow. It's an honor for me. I've had the honor of seeing very powerful businessmen, important people in government, pretty big people. I get the opportunity for a moment just to watch them kind of melt back into a nostalgic child. Just for a moment, they've got their $10,000 suit on and they run the largest company in the state or whatever. And, oh, your dad was Harley Race. Oh, wow. And you just see them become a little boy or a little girl just for a second. Mm-hmm. And to me, it gives you chills, when you think about it. It's like, wow, that's really cool.
Mm-hmm. A fan on social media sent me a question he wanted me to ask you about. Of course, again, in the WWF, your dad was part of that amazing heel stable, the Bobby Heenan family. Still, one that's extremely talked about to this day. They wanted to know if your dad had any funny stories dealing with the Brain, who was, of course, one of the shrewdest and most humorous individuals in the history of the business.
First of all, Bobby was about one of the more funniest guys you'll ever meet. I mean, if his job wasn't what he did, it would have been a stand-up comic. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if he did routine very well, because he was just so quick. Something like when the dressing room, is anybody lose any money? Is it green? When tasers first came out, when mace and pepper spray went on the wayside and the tasers came out, he got my dad a taser, and he said, "We're going to use this on guys in the dressing room." And so the public doesn't know this. He didn't ever tase someone out in the ring, and he'd go up. Someone was aggravating him or whatever, and he'd tase him. And Bobby, when the guy would come to, Bobby would by then take the taser out of his hand and look over the guy like he did it. He's looking down at this guy 3 times his size. And, don't mess with me again. And it was my dad that did it, but he took the credit for it. So he did crazy little things like that. He'd stand up in a bar after the matches were over, crowded bar, a lot of wrestlers there, a lot of fans, whatever. And he'd stand up and he'd say, in his voice that he used to call my dad, the king and whatever, in that kind of a, like the court, not the court jester, but like the sergeant of arms in the Congress, Mr. Speaker, the president. He'd say, "The king would like to buy the bar around." He'd had to look up. He's like, "What's he gonna do then?" So he bought the bar around.
That's hilarious.
But yeah, he had fun. He didn't had fun playing with people and getting ribbed himself.
Not speaking in ring, but again, the Dark Side of the Ring episode touched on some of your.
You froze a little bit there. Not what?
You got me back?
Yeah, I got you now.
Okay. Not inside the ring, but the Dark Side episode touched on the family times that you had outside of the ring. What would be some of your fondest memories of your dad on those rare occasions that he was actually home?
He was such a kind guy, but he was so funny. People just really didn't know how funny he was. But spending any time with him, whether we were playing golf, whether we went hunting, it was just so much fun. It was like it was a vacation when he came in town for me. You know, it was like, oh, cool, Dad's here. He's like a jungle gym. So he really poured out his heart when he was with me to be a father and to try to be up on things and keep track of my school, my grades, my football, my whatever I was doing, because he was gone a lot, and I know that it really hurt him that his job required that of him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, that's why they didn't want me to be a wrestler. It was hard being away from your family that much, and especially the schedule he kept back then. He wrestled. He told this story. I don't know if it was in the Dark Side, or maybe maybe I'm talking about a different time, but he wrestled on, I believe it was December 17th in Tokyo, Japan for 1 hour. He wrestled in Los Angeles, California again on December 17th because of the international dateline flying back for 1 hour. And on December 18th in San Juan, Puerto Rico for 1 hour. Basically 3-hour matches in 2 days with 12,000, 14,000 miles traveled. No one kept a schedule like that, nor could they. No one could figure out how the heck he could do it.
Yeah, no wonder so many did not want the NWA world title.
No.
A fan is asking, what music did Harley like? A little change up here.
Country.
Okay, cool.
Charlie Pride was his guy. Charlie, Willie, and Waylon. Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings. I'm trying to think of the old 8-track tapes we used to listen to on the boat. God, it would be nice to have some of those 8-track tapes now. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was one other. Charlie Pride. Oh, and Jerry Reed.
Gotcha.
From Smokey and the Bandit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That I'm going a little off here, but Smokey and the Bandit reminds me of a story. I'm working on a book soon to be published called "Don't Tell Your Mother," and it's exactly what it sounds. The title says it all. And one of the stories, I was thinking of the Smokey and the Bandit business. In 1977, my dad bought my mom a Porsche 911 SC Targa. And back then, they didn't have manufacturers all over the world. He bought a Porsche. It was handmade in Germany and sent here. So he gets this car, she gets this car, and he and I take off. And there's a road here in Kansas City where now it's homes and stores and shopping and whatever. Back then, it was like dirt roads and one highway that went right through the middle of it. And he called that the Autobahn because the police didn't have really enough officers to patrol that far out. So we get on that road, the Autobahn, and off we go in this Porsche. And when you see the officer going that fast, what are you going to do? So on by, and they like Smokey and the Band. Remember when in Smokey and the Band, that movie, when they pulled the patrol cars up nose to nose across the freeway, and the officers are on the other side pointed the guns over the top of the hood and the trunk of the car. Well, they set up a roadblock like that. So we slows down and pulls up to this roadblock, and 10, 12 officers walk around their cars, start walking at us like in a semicircle. All of them had their hands on their hips, ready to draw the gun. One of them broke forward And he walked over and he looked into the driver's side of the car and he, Mr. Race, do you have any idea how fast you were going? And my dad said, well, the speedometer was pegged at 150. Not going to hide it. And the officer said, sir, you were doing 163 miles an hour. And at the time, all speed limits were 55. He said, you were tripling the speed limit. And Dad said, wow, I saw you. I was letting off. I'm going faster than that. And he said, well, it's a new car. I'm breaking it in. And the officer said, well, sir, now that the car is broken in, the speed limit is around 70 or 55 miles an hour. Okay. All right. He said, would you mind signing some autographs for the guys? And he said, no. So he went out and signed a bunch of autographs, got back in the car. We turned around to come home. No ticket, no nothing. And he looks over at me, 7-year-old, don't tell your mother. And I didn't.
That's great.
Yeah. Hundreds of stories like that. Like I said, he was a character. He was funny. You had to be there for the moment that he was.
Yeah, we'll have to keep in touch and have you back when the book comes out to discuss.
Oh yeah,
that.
absolutely. I appreciate that. Absolutely.
In terms, I know this could be a difficult question, but I appreciate your time. You've been very generous this evening.
Oh, absolutely.
If you had to summarize in terms of pro wrestling, the legacy of your father's body of work, what would that be?
Legend. There isn't a move that's done today that he didn't either invent or perfect. I think that the respect that the guys give him right up until the day he passed away, by the younger kids who weren't born, those guys hadn't been born when he retired either. And now they're professionals and they're, well-known WWE, but they was still Mr. Race or the boss. And the fans that I've been just overwhelmed and just thrilled with the response from just before when the dark side was starting to be promoted. And then as it happened. And then since then, going forward, I get thousands of text, whatever, social media a day with people that it's almost like he's their father or something. I mean, he just had such an emotional attachment with his fans. I mean, I guess the rock stars, they'd almost call them like groupies. And I think that all of those things together just kind of culminate in what else could he be but a GOAT or legend. Because he was as tough as there's not one thing that's been said about him that it wasn't true. He's as tough as they say that he was. He was as good of a technical wrestler as they say he was. He was as good of a brawler as anyone says he was. They're all true. If you hear something about him and it's one of those things that catches you and you're like, holy crap, it's probably true.
Yeah, an absolute true legend. Justin, where can the fans, and I know you have your plate full, so to speak, with people contacting you, but where can they find you on social media?
You froze up.
I just said that I know you have your plate full, but where can the fans find you on social media? Oh,
plate full or not, as I said, it's an honor, and I try to answer. If I can't say something, a thumbs up, I try to answer every one of them. I know that's what my dad would want. Justin Race on Facebook, and I can be searched under Justin Race on Instagram, but the actual username on Instagram is Just Bobs with 2 B's, JUSTBOBBS. And then Facebook is Justin Race. Pretty easy to find.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you again for your time. It's certainly been one I've been looking forward to, being a longtime fan of your.
Yeah, me too. I'm fine. I know we had to cancel one of these. I'm glad we finally got to do it. I really enjoyed it.
And we're going to keep in touch and ensure that when your book comes out or you have any other developments along those lines, we'll have you back and do it again. So again,
Jack, I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, fans, that's it for this edition.
Have a good one.
Thank you. Of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. Fans, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button to thehannibaltv.com. hit the like button if you enjoyed this interview. But most importantly, stay on top of all the great content that we have coming this year for you. So until next time, fans, take care.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please help me out and like this video, then click the subscribe and get notifications buttons so you don't miss any of my latest shoot interviews, match videos, or news updates. Follow us on Facebook at the Hannibal TV.